Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on day 2 of Degrowth Week. And today is a very special discussion with the very fabulous and my dear friend, Mary Graham. First, I'll actually do some housekeeping and an acknowledgement of country. And then we'll introduce Mary, and then I'm going to give some opening remarks, and then Mary will give a presentation, and then Mary and I will give some reflections together and open up for Q&A with you. So we're really pleased you can join us, and do please stay on mute if you can. That would be great. And if you've got questions, comments, please pop them in the chat at any time. So bear with me and I'll share screen. So firstly, I really want to acknowledge all the amazing human beings who've been working together to set up Degrowth Week this week. And I'll talk a bit more about the Degrowth Network Australia and the New Economy Network Australia. But I really want to acknowledge my co-organisers, Tonya Fields, Anissa Rogers and Sarah Bashforth. And there's a whole bunch of other folks who've been part of it. But thank you for being part of it too, as a participant and a supporter. As you will have seen from our beautiful image, and a huge thank you to NENA's James Lee for our psychedelic snail, representing the importance of going a little bit slower in modern industrialized societies. But as you can see from this glorious little image, we've got an amazing array of speakers, and I'll remind you of the program in just a moment. But firstly, I would like to acknowledge country. A tradition that's growing in Australia, and I think it's a lot more than just tokenism. I think for many of us, it's our way of acknowledging where we live, and our genuine commitment to decolonising as non-Indigenous people, our understanding of this place. So it's become quite the Zoom tradition for folks to acknowledge country or mention where they are in the chat. So please feel free to write in the chat where you're from. I love reading them and seeing where you all are. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Kabi Kabi and Jinnabara traditional custodians. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past and present, and the emerging young people and leaders who are continuing ancient traditions of caring for country and caring for each other. All Aboriginal lands across this continent are unceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And that beautiful image, they're the Glasshouse Mountains. And I've only just moved up to this part of Moreton Bay, and it's just a glorious place. So if you'd all like to just take a little moment to reflect on the glory of where you live, I think that's a nice way to start today's discussion. So in our webinar today, we're really delighted to have Mary Graham join us, and she'll be sharing Indigenous insights and how the relationist ethos can inform Australia's journey to a post-growth future. I like to think of the discussions that Mary and I talk about and give as a tale of two cultures. When Mary talks about her culture and all the different aspects of the philosophy and political structures and governance that underpin her society, I learn every time more and more about my own. And I should acknowledge that I'm a non-Indigenous person, 6th generation Maloney, born on this continent, and a product of the Irish political prisoners brought to Australia as part of the British Empire's colonial project. So as someone who's non-Indigenous, working with Mary Graham and others in Future Dreaming has been a great privilege and an absolutely amazing way to change one's way of thinking about the entire world. So that's pretty good. So I've just got to do a little bit of, oh, excuse me, my dog is going crazy. If you can hear howling, I shall get him rescued in a moment. But just a quick reflection on what degrowth is, what it's about, and why we're looking at it this week. I won't read this whole slide, but just to remind folks that degrowth refers to a set of theories and also a powerful, growing social and economic movement that critiques the paradigm of endless economic growth. And the idea that endless economic growth is not possible on a finite planet isn't an original idea, but the ideas around degrowth are that we really need to ensure that wealthy, over-consuming economies move away from GDP, scale down our material use, consumption, production, and focus on economic activity that secures human needs within the boundaries, healthy ecological boundaries of bioregions and our entire planet. And I always like to remind folks that degrowth is not the ultimate end goal. We don't want to shrink and shrink until there's nothing of us left. What we need, particularly for societies like Australia, is to deliberately contract and reduce what we take from Mother Earth and what we take from each other, so that we can move back towards what some folks would have called a steady state economy. And we'll talk about that again later. But once upon a time, there were less of us across this planet, and we did have one planet living. Things have changed, and I guess our ultimate challenge, and one of the reasons degrowth is so important and so controversial, is it really does mean industrial societies need to change. I won't speak to the program, but just a reminder, if you've only just been finding out about what sessions are on this week, the Humanitics page and the New Economy website has all the different sessions. I want to give a quick plug. It's important for us to promote all the awesome volunteers. No one's in a paid position in NENA or DNA, so we really want to give a plug for the Degrowth Network Australia. The email address is right there, and there's a page or two hosted on the New Economy website. The Degrowth Network is a place for people who want to connect and maybe already acting towards creating a degrowth world. And NENA, the New Economy Network Australia. NENA is all about bringing individuals and organisations together to discuss and promote new ways of thinking about the role of an economy within human society and to shift towards systems that support people and planet. We host a diverse range of hubs, including the Degrowth Hub, and more we're seeing our hubs made up of the amazing people who are out there in the real world doing the real work. So thank you. That was my introduction. I'm now going to ask Mary if she'd just like to give a brief introduction to herself. I feel very rude not having let Mary say hello. And then I'll turn into a speaker, not just a moderator, and give a short 5-8 minutes of context and then hand over to Mary for the rest of the session. But I will stop sharing for a moment. Mary, did you want to say hello and introduce yourself? And that'll also give me a moment to see to my dog. Thank you very much.
So my name is Mary Graham. I'm speaking to you from the Gold Coast, actually. This is my father's people's area. Yugambeh language speaking people, and my own actual group within that bigger group is Kombumerri. So the actual strip that is called the Gold Coast, that's the Kombumerri mob there. However, the whole group goes from the Logan River right down to the Tweed River, and then back into the foothills of the Great Range. So this is my father's people's area. My mother's people's area is Waka Waka. She was a Waka Waka person from the Burnett River district. She had been on Cherbourg, a reserve, under that legislation, eventually coming out from under that legislation to be exempted, like thousands of people became exempted from it. So in that sense, in the Western law sense, she was free then. So my father's mob wasn't ever under that legislation. So I've got lots of relatives all around Southeast Queensland on both sides. And I come from a big immediate family, and I have a talented son, artist, writer, poet, also. And I've worked in Aboriginal affairs for a very long time. Yep, thanks.
Thank you, Mary. That's wonderful. So what I wanted to do is just introduce the fact that Mary and I are working on a book together at the moment. We're calling it roughly Future Law, Tracking the Relationist Ethos. And really, it's a wonderful process of imagining or reimagining Australian society if it were built on Aboriginal philosophy, and particularly some of the concepts that Mary will be talking about today. And I sort of tongue-in-cheek, the title of my very short introduction to this sort of tale of two cultures is, why are my people obsessed with growth? And when I say my people, I mean the Eurocentric folks that I'm descended from and who conquered or invaded Australia in 1788 and brought modern Australia into this globalized, often Eurocentric in terms of some of the Western ideas, ways of thinking. So very quickly, what I'm interested in and what Mary and I often talk about is the governance of the continent now known as Australia. And by governance, it's kind of people roll their eyes or fall asleep when you talk too much about governance, but I often joke that governance is the sexy stuff. Governance is all about the rules that we create to live, work, and play together at every scale of human endeavour. And although they're supported in many different cultures in different ways by laws or regulations or moral codes, it's the culture and the values that lie beneath a society that shape the way that we interact with each other and the way that we interact with the living world. And as you'll soon see, the way that Mary Graham talks about the relationist ethos really throws into contrast how Westerners do think or don't think about a deeper land ethic and how things like an economic system should or shouldn't work. So to just put ourselves into this context of contrasting different cultural worldviews about degrowth and the idea of growth, let's just remember that the modern nation state of Australia is relatively young. Legally speaking, Australia was created in 1901 when the different colonies that the New South Wales and other governors had created under the British Empire, when all the different colonies came together. Australia then is in the heart of what we would call a modern industrialised Western nation. And it's also been a huge contributor to biodiversity loss and a small contributor, but a contributor nonetheless, to the ecological crises we face today with climate change and other planetary-wide issues now. And the big question that people often ask and that we explore with my other organisation, AILA, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, is how did we get here? A lot of people have different ideas about how we got to a point where we're growth obsessed and taking too much from the living world. Some people claim that it's the neoliberalism of the 1980s. Others point to the 1950s and the Great Acceleration, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. Others point to the European Industrial Revolution and the sort of sudden and dramatic increase in fossil fuel extractivism to power the motorised and mechanised systems of industrial production. Still more point to European colonisation and expansionism, which started in the late 1500s and expanded all over the planet. And others, like Derek Jensen and other commentators, point to large-scale agriculture, which started 10,000 years ago in places that are now called the Middle East. Whatever the cause, whatever the reason, the cultural aspects underneath where we are really do matter, and I'll come back to that. For those who've never seen this material, both to honour our beautiful friend Will Steffen, who passed away early this year, but also to show you the remarkable contrasting increase in our consumption of the planet, I just wanted to show you these two slides. I'll flick between two. So there's this one, which is the impacts on the planet. I'll come back to that. Then there's this one, which is the causes. Now, even if you can't see that very clearly, if you see the dotted line, that's 1950. And if you look at whether it's carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, ocean acidification, marine fish capture, what you'll see after 1950 is the line is going up and not slowly. Most of the time it's exponential. And this is what Will Steffen and other Earth system scientists call the Great Acceleration. This perfect storm post-Second World War of industrial technology, and particularly the US or North American globalized economic system really taking over even the old ideas of colonization from Europe, to create this vast capacity to take, to expand and extract from Mother Earth. So the Great Acceleration, though, is just a symptom of thinking. It's not a new thing. And understanding and I apologize to those who are from overseas. I see a number of you are on this call, which is lovely, but I'm talking particularly about the Australian colonial history because it's the thing that I look at the most and worry about the most. Colonisation, of course, refers to large-scale population movements. But when colonisation takes place under the protection of governments and institutions, colonial structures, it's often called settler colonialism, which I think is a misnomer. You can still call it invader colonialism. But what we often see, and as a non-Indigenous person now in her early 50s in Australia, what we see in our continent, particularly previous to the last 10 years, is an almost complete denial about the colonial nature of our legal systems and the colonial nature of the way we think. What that means is we're still embedded in a society that's looking to certain concepts from an entirely another place in terms of how we govern ourselves, govern our society, and do or don't care for country. So that colonial, particularly Eurocentric way of thinking can be challenged right down to why we celebrate Christmas in December with images of snow and reindeers when we live in a place where most people are at the beach or at the pool. Why are we continuing to cling to so much of the Eurocentric colonial notions of economy, environment, and even the way we interact in our society? So my part of the talk today is really just to remind those of us on this call today who are not Indigenous that the way we think about the economy, the fact that we even need to contemplate degrowth, is because our culture, our people have been so obsessed with growth. I often, in longer talks about governance and the history of the place, invite people to contemplate a map of the world pre-1400. It was a diverse, complex biocultural jigsaw puzzle across the whole planet. But once the folks in this tiny pocket of the world decided to leave home, go to other places, take, use, trade, steal, destroy, share, some of it was good, then really the landscape of our cultural history changed forever. This is the British Empire, which we can speak to particularly here in Australia. So there's the good old motherland. And in 1917, they could easily say, and for many hundreds of years before, the sun never set on the British Empire. It took over so many places. And I know many of we know this, but when we're thinking about literally challenging the root causes of our economic problems, we have to think back to why is our Australia today still part of this obsession with expansionism and extractivism. And that's because if you think about it at a very simple level, the people who left Europe looking for more had pretty much devastated part of their ecosystems and had been warring and fighting in different ways for lots of time. But why did they all cut down their own forests to build big boats and to go off to other places? It was European colonial competition, a savagery when it came to inter-European warfare, curiosity, knowledge seeking, absolutely, many good aspects too. But when you look at the expansionist, extractivist nature of the culture that came to this continent in 1788, my people, we can see what we did to this place when you look at this very high level map. This is 1788 with the vegetation cover of all of Australia, and that's 2016. And the white is where places have been so terraformed, they no longer have any of the original vegetation. And that's just at one level of telling the story of place. So if we're going to embrace notions of degrowth and challenge the very economic systems that we live within, we have to challenge our culture. And that's really all I wanted to do, was sort of set the context for my people's obsession with growth, and the reason we need to think very deeply about how we address degrowth in Australia is because we're going against the grain of not just 50 years or 100, but hundreds and hundreds and even 1,000 years of thinking that when we run out of stuff, we can always get some more. And I find it fascinating in contrast when I listen to many Indigenous people, and certainly the way Mary talks about these underpinning systems of thinking and governing oneself in this country, almost the quintessential example of a steady state, the idea of what do we have to do to live here forever? Not to move on when we run out, but to live here forever, wherever here is. So on that note, I'm delighted now to hand over to Mary Graham. And Mary, please feel free to talk for 30 minutes if you wish. We've then got another half an hour for questions and discussions. And folks, I'll be keeping an eye on your questions or comments as they come through. But Mary, thanks so much for your patience as I give my intro. And yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me here to contribute. I was thinking of just the idea of growth. Does it mean moderate prosperity? See, that idea about moderate prosperity, I quite like that. I think it's something that the Chinese use, moderate, you know, not going all out like scorched earth kind of idea, getting as much as you can, wherever you can, under any kind of circumstances,
Yeah.
you know, and so on and so on. And I was thinking, the ideas and the cultural values that grew with Aboriginal people in this country. It starts out with relationalism. So it starts from almost like completely the other way about, other way around from many other cultures. Not to say anything critical about other cultures, but the idea was that upon being reflectively realizing how different we are to other life forms, and that because these various things that we share with other life forms, things like physicality, spirituality, whether science believes that or not, the majority of the world's population believes that humans, Homo sapiens, do have an idea of spirituality, and sentience, not sentience, what do you call it? Various things anyway, but not reflectivity. Other life forms don't have that. So you can't imagine, say, koala bears sitting in a tree discussing the meaning of life. Only we do that. Only we do that. So we try and figure out who we are, where we are, and where we are determines who we are actually. So the idea is that land is the inventor, creator, if you like. The only difference is it's not a god or gods. No, we do have ancestors, but they weren't turned into gods either, which I think happened all around the world, many other ancient cultures. So our idea was that the land has invented us, it looks after us, it turns into a reciprocal relationship, a relationalist relationship, if you like. So therefore, because it's a two-way thing, relationalism, we're obliged to look after it. We're obliged to look after land the way it's looked after us. So the very idea of exploiting it for your own or your own mob, as in group, country, we refer to our own places as a country, my mother's country, my father's country, and so on. So you wouldn't do that at the expense of somebody else. You just simply wouldn't do it, because the land is a sacred thing, and it has invented us. So we mustn't treat it in a in that kind of way of exploiting it. So we're obliged forever to keep looking after it. And what that does and did was give rise to an idea of a law of obligation. You are obliged to look after land, but also if when having and eventually over these thousands of years, having an idea of what kind of social and political system that we're going to have, governance, if you like. And we're so old, Aboriginal people, you know, the system is so old that we quite probably invented the whole idea of governance, because when you look at this map, even though this map was made by a white fella, the reality of all those places is real. It's a real thing. And so the idea of, for example, wars of conquest is a completely foreign concept, completely foreign. Ideas or behaviours, conduct, like conflict, all kinds of versions of conflict. In different Aboriginal languages, there are all sorts of words for every form of conflict you can think of. Just plain war, a battle, kill, murder, feud, duel, and so on and so on. There's probably more meanings of conflict, but there's a word for all of them. The one word that is absent there is invasion. There doesn't seem to be any word for invasion. That's a classic invasion, invade, subjugate, victory, conquest, invade, conquest, and subjugate and take over other people's land by that. So that doesn't seem to be there. So you have to keep that in the forefront of your mind, that people have lived in these places for that long. That is, we're talking about tens of thousands of years. And it has been proved. It has actually been proved scientifically. And several times, actually. And of course, they worked out ways in which they could have a settled, stable society with no problems of intermarriage. What's called consanguinity. People might know that. Too close a cousin marriage. So they worked out a brilliant mathematical system where they avoided that. And of course, that meant arranged marriages, or rather promised marriages. So people in small societies could live in a place for literally thousands of years, and nothing untoward or health threatening could happen there. So they looked out for all kinds of things. The law of obligation to land, which was the basis or foundational part of it, and that became the what do you call it? The blueprint, if you like, for the kind of social and political governance system that was there. A friend of mine quite often calls it what our system was, a system of a long-term experiment in human order making. And that's exactly what it is. It's a human order making over a very long period of time. And of course, it's an island continent. And we did have neighbours, of course, Torres Strait Islanders, people from further north, Asians coming and going, trading and so on. But no attempts at taking over country or anything. That would have been seen as too strange. So from all of that original idea, that we've got to look after land, so we've got to have a system that doesn't take advantage of our neighbours. So, for example, looking after, say, resources, natural resources, we don't start competing over it or rivaling each other over what do you do with resources. You collaborate with each other as in autonomous regard. You look after it. And even if you don't like this neighbour or that person, doesn't matter, you continue with this kind of behaviour where you share in the looking out for all of the resources. So it might involve protocols, all kinds of ceremonies, and so on. But above all, you could put all of that within a kind of general idea of diplomacy. So it's something else that Aboriginal people probably invented too, is diplomacy. How to get on with each other without killing each other off, how to look after the land without falling into rivalry and things like that. So now you might assume that this is all very moralistic, ethical, and it is in the way of the law. You're doing the right thing by the law by being a responsible person. Obligatoriness comes first, and so on. But above all, it's simply common sense. And the more I think about and talk and read and discuss things with relatives and family, friends, it seems like it's you could call it a culture of all sorts of things, but it seems to be a culture of common sense. It's rational and logical to get on with each other rather than fight over things, so that everybody wins. Modern things like win-win situations. Well, I think they probably invented that too, without knowing those words about it. So the idea of a steady state system, which I know you probably already all know, it's mainly used in chemistry. If there's a particular kind of stuff, that's some other kind of stuff is added to it, and if it doesn't fit, the whole thing blows up. But a really good steady state sort of situation is where, when it's in involves crises or other things coming into it, it might have some problems, but it lasts. It lasts forever. And I sometimes give a weird, and you might think it's a weird example, but I think of all things, I know you probably the wrong word to use, but the Titanic, and everybody knows what happened to the Titanic. But just imagine Titanic as in a ship of state, So apparently, not going through the whole thing, but apparently it ran into huge problems because certain people, the wrong kind of people, were in certain positions which didn't look at the safety of the whole ship of state. In our old system, you had to have the right kind of governance system where the right kind of knowledgeable people, truly knowledgeable people with ethics, run things. So what happened there with the old ship, Titanic, is that they didn't take any notice of what should and could have been done at that, and that's how it ended. If such a thing, such an amazing genius thing like the Titanic was built by Aboriginal people, it would still be sailing around probably, So it wouldn't be a hierarchical invention. There wouldn't be a class system where the poorest people were in the bottom, and they're the ones that died first, apparently, most of them. The well-off were up in the best rooms on the top, and they got rescued. So it wouldn't be any system, class or caste system like that either. And the whole safety kind of philosophy of the whole place would have been to look after everybody, but above all, have the right kind of people with the right ethics running it, So to me, that's what a steady state kind of notion, idea is. And as for a steady state economy, it seems to me to be the idea of you have to have a steady state society in order to have a steady state economy. You have to have the same kind of society or governance system that looks like that fits that steady state idea, which can last for as long as you want, really. So that's why I was asking about the idea of a moderate prosperity. For example, 10,000 years ago, I think that's when large, what do you call it? Agriculture, big scale agriculture started. And of course, unfortunately, it led to some wonderful things, technology, greater prosperity, great power. But unfortunately, everybody fell into the trap of rivaling competition over it. And while it was a softer hierarchy before that, once that started, great wealth and power coming from large-scale agriculture, it became rigid hierarchies, and of course, rivalry, competition, big wars they have to work out who's going to own all this or run all of this those areas, those regions where all this is happening. And the unfortunate thing is that it hasn't changed right up to now. That's 10,000 years ago. The basic idea of having a very powerful system that owns a hegemony, if you like, that owns and controls all the resources in the world. That's still an idea that's behind, well, you could say capitalism, or you could say it's an idea of governance, politics, global politics, and so on and so on. So the idea of having that system, which is why a lot of people are looking at reforming, they've become more aware, but how to correct it. It's no good having self-awareness and no self-correction, both in an individual sense or a group or countrywide or state. We're talking about states with a small s. You have to have that kind of idea of correcting. But there doesn't seem to be any, it doesn't seem to be any idea of that. One idea is working with some people at the moment about, well, we're right at a crossroads, really. It's not the first crossroad, but it looks like it might be the final crossroads or milestone or whatever you call it, where there are lots of perfect storms gathering together. You know, perfect storms like climate change, pandemics, perhaps waiting in the wings, stage right, is a possible third world war, you know, possibly. That's another one. There's probably others, perhaps, who knows. AI is also another, could be a perfect storm. People are already worried about it and so on. So when we come to this sort of idea, it's a good idea for people to start thinking about perhaps not just a new, different kind of governance system, but look at the idea of long-termism. So you can look back 10,000 years to agriculture, where the big changes happened. The big changes happened, but then try and look ahead of 10,000 years in the future. Do you know what I mean? What do you think is still going to be around? Is capitalism still going to be around in 10,000 years' time? Who knows? You don't know, you know, but from the point of view of Aboriginal people of thousands, tens of thousands of years, we can look at that. We can look at what all the things that are happening. What will that look like in long-termism? You know, it doesn't look good. It's not exactly hopeful unless they start looking at things differently, basically. As in, look after land first, because that's a on-board training session for having an ethical system. That's actually what it is. Looking after something outside of the self, without any kind of a god or gods or gurus or brilliant geniuses, you know, telling you what to do, how you could do these things. But start from that point of view, relationalism with land, using that as the template for the kind of society, the governance system. So everybody's got to be looked after. It's not as if it's a brand new thing. I always admired the old English idea of a national health service. If we didn't know anything about England or English people or anything, but we heard about something called a national health service, I mean Aboriginal people hearing about that, we would recognise that straight away as the law of obligation being enacted out. So wonderful old system, which is slowly being destroyed apparently from what I read. Free health care, very good quality health care for everybody, the poorest, they didn't have to pay for any of it. And everybody is included in that old system, that NHS system. But it's slowly being destroyed by certain parties, political parties and vested interests. They want to change it into an American system where nobody is looked after, basically, and people are very poor. They just have to be, they're shunted aside, you know, they can't afford good health and so on. So that idea, one idea is that's the law of obligation being attended to. Well, just imagine a whole society that looks at the whole of society, the system like that. That's actually what you, and then you can look at long-termism, because it'll become a reality that, you know, and looking after things outside of the self means that you have to actually do it. That's what ethics are. Ethics is a doing thing. It's not some high ideal that I tried to be a good person and so on and so on and so on. But you actually have to do the thing, you know, like ethics, an ethical system. So there's a whole lot of other things too. But I'll leave it there for a while if you want to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. There are some questions. So
make comments, make disagreements by all means, you know. I'm used to curly questions.
Mary, we've got a couple of questions there, but perhaps before we do, I might just share screen again to show the map of the current Aboriginal map of Australia. So Mary, just one thing I wanted to invite you to talk about for a moment is the almost bioregional nature of place. Do you know, in some of your longer talks, you and I discussed the fact that modern science has now caught up with the fact that Aboriginal people weren't just on this continent for 60,000 years. The idea that people moved here, or that's a whole different issue. Aboriginal people say they've always been here. There are different ways of looking at it. But modern science proved in one place that a certain group of Aboriginal people had been in one bioregion for 50,000 years. Can we talk a little bit about that location and place-based just before we go into some of the economic stuff? Because I'm, as a non-Indigenous person, personally fascinated with the idea that the law comes from the land. And then in effect, what the wise elders were handing down and sharing with their young'uns was, this is the budget we're working with. This is the world we have, and this is how we look after the place. Did you have any comments or thoughts you wanted to elaborate on for that?
Well, not so much about the bioregional, because I don't understand. I'm not really as well as you and other environmentalists. But when you look at that map, when anybody looks at that map, and then you look at this map here, it's amazing where people decided to stop. And that thing about the old out of Africa kind of idea, it might sound strange to you, but I believe that. I think that's right. That is early humans, Homo sapiens. They did come from that place, like 2 million and a half or something like that years old. So the first thing in their great long development is the idea of who and what they are, how different they are to other sources, other life beings, and all the time developing and growing, shifting out of that country, that continent, going north, across, around the other side of the world, coming down south through what became the Americas, and then what became another group coming down below through what became Asia, coming into this country. And of course, this country, like many other countries, geographically, was still connected up. So the idea of walking into the country is here. However, I believe that's science, but I also believe, and this might sound strange, two completely opposing truths, and they're both right. I believe that when Aboriginal people talk about, no, we didn't come from anywhere else, we only came from this country, that's true also. Because people, human beings, still developing, and especially through reflectivity. So people coming in, according to the scientists, anthros, coming around the edges and then occupying the center. And it seems as if when people are realizing that we're different to other forms of life, we're quite different, we're connected, we have those things that we have the same things that they have. Well, like I said before, physicality, spirituality, sentience, consciousness, what's that word? Very common. You have to stay alive.
Survivalism,
yes.
no,
no, it's like that.
Needs?
no. Geez, sorry, but it's the thing. It's sort of like the survival of the fittest, almost. That kind of thing. Instinct, of course. 5 things. We share that with others, but we also have reflectivity. Now, when we have reflectivity, we realized because this was always a thing for us too to work out, how is it that people were, even though for tens of thousands of years in those places, when they came in and discovered their humanness in that place. And this is from reflectivity of realizing the differences, realizing who we are, especially that the fact that we have ancestors, but so all the other life forms that have ever been, they're our ancestors too. But our human ancestors going way, way back, or even immediate, that's what makes us, we come from a particular land, and the energy comes from that land that helped us with this reflectivity. When that's realized, we are who we are. We're human. We are such and such. We come from this place here, and funnily enough, that's when that's also when whitefellas first coming off the boats and so on. meeting Aboriginal people on the beach, whether it's a fight or not, the white fellas asking black fellas, "Who are you?" And that the answer was, "I'm from here." Quite often, everywhere, "I am from here. I am who I am because I'm from here." You know, and that might have the number of languages. The number of languages determines that. So "I'm from here." That phrase is in a particular kind of language. And that's who you are. So you discover via reflectivity that the land itself is the thing that's grown you up, created you, grown you up, and so on. There are umpteen numbers of dreaming stories like that, how the land, and this is via different forms of life forms, flora, fauna, everything. They're kind of the intermediary spirits, spirit life that helps brought us into being. So, for example, that's why in dreaming stories, you won't hear anything about monkey dreaming or elephant dreaming. It's not in race memory. The only memory is all the life forms that are in this country here. So we come from this country. We became fully, completely and utterly human, Homo sapiens, in this country only, not in that other country, not in that place. We were growing as that, but when we come here, we become that finally, a final growth, and that's why people are in those places, and so on. So it's a completely different idea, and it is true. It's they're two truths, and they're both right. In a funny kind of way, if you've heard some of these dreaming stories, there's some brilliant ones, and it really, literally is a story about how the land itself, the soil, humans emerged out of this soil of that place with the help of flora and fauna. They're actual stories like that. So in a way, science is actually right. But what Aboriginal people did was sacralize that story. They sacralized the story, and so science wouldn't sacralize it because it doesn't believe in it. Not yet. They will discover it sooner or later, but they'll call it something else. Yeah, I'll bet you anything. So it's just a different kind of place, and as I said, it's been a different idea, and it has been proved that people have been in a place. There was some hair strands that they'd found in Adelaide Museum, or somewhere in that area, put it in the Adelaide Museum, which is an important go-to place for a whole lot of professional people. And they promptly lost it in the museum, would you believe? And a few years ago, somebody found it again in the museum, which was, in a way, the best place to protect it, otherwise it would have been lost forever. And they discovered how old it is. I forget how old but they found it tens of thousands of years old. And then they thought, this is a great idea, great opportunity to compare it with the actual living Aboriginal people there now around Adelaide. And to their amazement, they're the same people. That hair strand, the DNA in it, is the same in DNA in the living Aboriginal people. And they figured it out at about 50 to 60,000 years, and that's how long they've been there. So,
and you and I have talked about this, Mary, folks, please, Mary and I are dear friends, and we can be very honest about stories and ideas. And so as a non-Indigenous person growing up, I was taught that Aboriginal people were poor hunter-gatherers roaming endlessly,
primitive,
pointlessly,
didn't discover the wheel,
Oh, exactly. And when you hear Mary and so many other people talk about their country, their place, and then you connect that with modern scientific understandings of not just people being on the continent, but being in a localized place for such a long time, you realize that it's the Eurocentric folks wandering off from Europe, who are the lost white tribes, because they were literally looking for something else. But Aboriginal people didn't wander aimlessly. They knew exactly where they were. And it's that connection to place that I find fascinating coming from my culture. And I don't want anyone listening to think that we're bagging out on Western culture. We're not. There's brilliant things. And Mary is a huge fan.
We're not romanticizing Aboriginal people too, because a very real other argument against that, against what everything been said, is to say that, well, we were isolated for so long. so long. We couldn't, a whole lot of other peoples in different continents had to put up with being attacked by other people, completely different people, you know, the Mongolians and whatever you want to say, you know, the Romans coming in everywhere and so on and so on. They're attacking back and forth, back and forth. There are things like plagues. There are things like natural crises, volcanoes, earthquakes, everything. So Aboriginal people didn't have to put up with any of that, unless it was the earthquakes and things like that. There were a few here, volcanoes and that, and it's in the dreaming stories. But all of that kind of complete fighting forever, fleeing and fighting and fleeing and fighting. They never had to put up with any of that. They really were, like they say about an island, you know, island, what do you call it? Island. They use it as an example. Desert island discs, you know, what's your favorite?
Oh, right.
Yeah. So it really was a big continent, island. They had all that time to work out actually what makes for a stable society, a stable, and that's the key thing. It's stable. Don't think of it as peace, because as I said, you know, violence and conflict are just normal things. I know it sounds terrible, but it's a normal thing that humans have, because we have egos. You know, not everybody. You might have a autonomous regard system of interaction. That doesn't stop you from hating someone, though, does it? You know, there's lots of stories about people having wars, battles, and that, but not invasion. See, that was the big cutoff mark. You couldn't, so you can argue on top of the land, but not over land.
Yeah, and Mary, if we put it into the terms you talk about with, you know, the relationist ethos, the template is the relationship that human beings have with land. That is the first law.
That's the first law, yeah.
And then second laws, this is just my labeling of it. Second laws are all the people working each other out. And as a young non-Indigenous person, I would often listen to Dreamtime stories, or, you know, stories that were able to be shared with people that wasn't about sacred knowledge. And I remember thinking, it's always about people having an argument, and then there's like a teaching there. And so much of the discussions and many of the stories that a non-Indigenous person heard were very much about how people get along, because they'd already worked out how we get along with land, you know, like it was So we might link that to, there's been some lovely questions coming through. Thanks, everyone. So Tonya has asked a longer question, but I'll just come to the shorter part. She's asking, are there concepts in law or Aboriginal law that are passed on through song or story that reinforce these ideas of enough in a community? And if so, are they taught orally to children from a young age? And it reminds me, Mary, of one of the stories you told me, or a piece of writing where there's literally a baby's nursery rhyme about sharing and empathy, you know, one for you, baby, one for me.
Oh, yeah.
Baby.
It's an old lullaby.
Yeah.
I can't remember the words.
No.
But the tiny baby is being sung to about caring, you know what I mean? One for you, one for me. You know, look after this and look after that, and so on and so on. And of course, the baby doesn't have a clue what's being said or anything about it, but it's coming in, do you know?
It's sharing, and
it's sharing. Yes.
Saying, one for you, baby, one for me, baby, one for daddy, baby, one for
that's right,
baby. And it's literally sharing food. And I think that, like, sharing brought into that age at such an early age. Anyway, please.
And don't necessarily accept only the anthropological view, because an anthropology idea is, oh well, of course these are native peoples, hunter-gatherers. Of course they would be talking about that kind of thing, you know, helping to survive. You know, it's a survivalist thing. But actually, the real meaning of it is it's a rational, logical thing. It's rationality, logic, all those things that never get mentioned, all those words that never get mentioned in conjunction with Aboriginal people, you know, but they'd worked these things out beforehand. That's how you have a steady, stable society, you know. Peace comes and goes, you know, it comes and goes. And, you know, but to live in total peace all the time is a bit unrealistic. The best thing is to have what Aboriginal people worked out, is to have really, really excellent systems of how to manage conflict. manage conflict, because just accept that there sooner or later there will be conflict, and so you work out how do you handle this. And there are someone was telling me or reminded me of I always knew we had when people did get together and the fight broke out, there were actual places in your camp where you fought. You didn't just have a brawl. In fact, brawling in the old days, in the old ways, was very not acceptable, quite vulgar. When you have a fight, you have to have a fight in a proper way with all these rules, and a bit like old European things about having a duel.
The protocol.
Yes, protocols about how to have proper conflicts. Not just a free for all. Nowadays, yes, alcohol is a terrible
Colonization
thing.
disrupts the rules, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes. Well, they do, and right now, they do have health problems with that, and fights do break out, and dysfunctionalism in some communities, and so on. But the old system was that all of that was settled around about rules and diplomacy too. So you had, they used to call it now I forget that word, a squaring off place.
Okay.
You've squared off. If you have some kind of row and you're running into that person again, well, you'd go over there, take that fight over there in that squaring off area and have it out. And the having it out doesn't always mean physical fisticuffs, It might be a big argument, shouting match or whatever.
Like a European duel, but without the guns.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that dueling only stopped in World War One, apparently.
Yeah.
It was right up to including World War One. Dueling was still the way of settling things. And then the state, with the small s, the state everywhere, stepped in and said, you can't leave that to ordinary everyday people, the idea of violence. Only the state has control of violence. So they stopped dueling, But just imagine that. Yeah, that's what Aboriginal people do.
A couple of questions here that are directly related to economic thinking. One is, Peter's asked a great question, which I know you'll have some good things to say. In Aboriginal socio-economic arrangements, was there any idea of employment and unemployment?
You had, I don't know about employment, but you had people who were responsible for certain things. They're responsible, so someone was particularly good at, I don't know, who knows, some kind of hunting, not just hunting in general, but a very good. Someone wasn't so good, maybe somebody younger was learning, and so on. So older people might have been the experts at it, and so on. So it wasn't so much you're working for someone, but that they soon took that up, actually, Aboriginal people. I know my own mob here, they could see from all kinds of angles the payoffs, so to speak, of capitalism. So you sold your fish, your catch, and so many other people did that too in different parts of the country. They would sell whatever things they had, or they would do some work as in the Western system of work. They'd do that and get paid or not paid, but given some kind of resources, or something like that. Quite often unfair and so on too. But no, they understood it from the point of view of it helped to become, helped you and your family and your mob to be independent. So development, community development. And it's still the thing. It's still the same thing.
Yeah, pre-colonial, Mary, I know that you've talked about how really the units of community were obviously a lot smaller than today's cities, but elders and wise people would watch their young'uns and help support those with skills, as you just said. But there wouldn't have been any notions of unemployment or employment, because there was no notion of work. It was everybody had their job, their responsibilities, and learning about how to care for the place and how to make sure that resources were used.
There's an old story from the New South Wales, I think. The government of the day in the 1800s sometime, they were trying to find out, doing a survey about, I think, the whole thing of employment and work and things like that amongst people. So they did all that. across the country, or across maybe just New South Wales at the time. Anyway, this Scotsman apparently had owned land and he had Aboriginal people working with him. So he answered, of course, you know, it's all writing. And he was talking about the Aboriginal people working there. And he was describing it very interesting way. He said, yes, they work and I pay them and this is how much and so on and so on. So. But every now and then they go off on a, what he called, or they called, a walkabout at that time. But of course it was ceremonial reasons, particular reasons, you know, ritual stuff, hunting, you know, so they disappear. And he explained that by, and it was all okay with him. He explained that by saying the Aboriginal people, they don't work in that way. They're not like they're not employees like that or something like this. They attend to their responsibility, to their obligations. They look after the land. They attend sacred rituals, ceremonies, and so on. He said they don't work. They're gentlemen, and gentlemen don't work.
I think that's fantastic.
And I thought, what? And this is this Scotsman writing this at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, that's exactly what it is. You're a gentleman.
No different to the
gentlemen don't
racist
work.
slurs that I grew up listening to some folks say and other folks say.
But it amazed me that he could see that. He saw that straight away. He knew.
Yeah, he
exactly.
understood.
Yeah.
That,
and yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say that Indigenous society didn't have to put half of their population into a factory for 16 hours a day to make stuff. They'd worked out their life and they worked out how much time should be spent on ritual and community and singing and all the good stuff, I reckon. Anyway.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
You can't be interested in degrowth without challenging the industrial society's notion of endlessness of work and the grind of specialist work.
Yes.
You know, this idea that we're not allowed to be artists because we're all off being accountants. You know, the idea that we should be a fully rounded human being having a really nice life is what appeals to me. And
looking after land was a really important part. I don't know if people have read Bill Gamage's Greatest Estate on Earth, something like that. And the other fellow, what's his name?
Well, there's Bruce Pascoe's Dark
Bruce Pascoe, yeah. But this one of Bill Gamage, he talks about, and it almost gets boring actually when you read it, because what he finds in actual written letters of English people here writing back to their relatives in England is this description of, they're amazed at these Aboriginal people, how they looked after the land, because they kept saying things like, every new part of or region of the country we come across, it looks like a gentleman's estate. He says this again and again in so many different letters back to their relatives in England. And that's how they looked after the place. And you can call that work, but it's a caring thing. Can you imagine, like employment, business, if you like, always has to have this obligatoriness, law of obligation, as a foundational thing. You have to look after the land and look after people, because that's, you know, and so that's what all these regions look like. They look like gentlemen's estates. It didn't look like wild land or anything like that, nothing. And if you ever get to read that book, you'll see it almost becomes boring, because it's all these letters are coming back and forwards, you know, across the seas, and they keep saying that they're describing it, and they're amazed, of course, because they still have contradictory ideas about Aboriginal people being primitive hunter-gatherers, you see, just wandering about looking for something to eat and fighting. And of course it was anything but that. They really were like caretakers, stewards. And that's a one-line thing. I think I said it just before. A sacralized ecological collaborative stewardship system. It's not a religion, it's not an ideology, it's not even a philosophy, really. It's a worldview. If any Germans are there, there's a word called Weltanschauung. It means a very deep-centered worldview, deep down, you know. So you're not waiting for a God to tell you. This is what you've been taught, you see, for over tens of thousands of years. Look after land. And
in one of those lovely books that you put me onto, it's an older one, Patterns of Aboriginal Culture, then and
Oh,
now.
that one, yes.
Yeah, M. King Boys. The thing that struck me, and I was looking for the quote, is this idea that Aboriginal people shared their stories of creationism. Some white fellas now call it the dreaming, but what I loved was the way he described it, and I apologize, I can't say it properly, the idea that when people were born into their culture, their place, they were taught how to look after that place. And he
Yes.
actually uses a word almost like budget, but it wasn't budget. This idea that, and this is what appeals to me as someone who looks at bioregional governance for modern societies. How do we have the worldview that says our key obligation is to make sure life is continued in a beautiful way, all life, people, the creatures, and how do we learn from Indigenous wisdom, not appropriate, work in partnership, but rethink the way we govern ourselves so that we understand that we literally do live with a budget. If there's this many people in a place, there's only this much water, there's only this much oil. How do we do that? And Mary, one of the many questions, there's a lot of questions coming through around population. Now, it's a complex, controversial topic in Australia, but did you want to talk, and you don't have to, about anything to do with how Aboriginal people, being a deeply conservative group of people,
Oh, yes,
managed
they're very
population, and they managed, their rules were very strict on what you couldn't do, what you couldn't take. Did you want to talk about that at all?
A little bit. Only to say that a lot of people, especially the police, don't really realise just how conservative Aboriginal people really are, because everyone's so used to people, protesting in the streets and, having riots or whatever, or demanding this, demanding that. But actually and the real meaning of conservative, as people might know, not party conservative, of course, conservative meaning that tradition is very important, very important. Continuity is very important too. Older people, as knowledgeable people, you have to listen to them. That's all part of conservatism too. You have to know your place. Now, not in a class or caste sense, no hierarchy, nothing like that. But everybody has a place, everybody. And there's several other things that are purely conservative ideas about how to run a society, So all those things, modern things that have come in also to other cultures that aren't European, things like, socialism, communism, liberalism, all that they're all European. They're not Indigenous people's ideas at all. It's mainly conservative for us. But the other thing I want to say about working and business is that we have an old story here about dolphins. And I think this might have been the same all around the coastline, but all around the coastlines of other places that were like islands, I think throughout the Pacific, where the dolphin mob helped with the fishing for the human mob, And the story here is dreaming story, is that one day the human mob here did something very stupid. They took the whole catch after the dolphins had brought them in, herded the fish in, into a place to easily catch, and the human mob took the whole lot instead of paying like a contract, the dolphins' share of it, Well, now if it had been a religion, you would expect the human mob to get a big a zap, maybe a bolt of lightning or something, or some sort of punishment. Well, there was no obvious punishment in that way. All that happened was the dolphin mob departed the scene. They left. For it. Well, you want to break that contract, partnership, relationalism. You want to ignore that law of obligation and so on. Well, we'll go to, and so from then on, that was the punishment. You have to go and do your own fishing. You do it all. It's hard work, and you have to work hard. You got to get more people, and so on. It's a lot more. So that's what they were left with. And I thought I sometimes use that word, use that story when I'm talking to when there's law people there, lawyers, and that. I thought that is like a contract, and it really is. It's a sacred. It's a sacred thing. It is the land and everything in it, but in a sense, you have that kind of relationalism with all of it. And the obvious thing is with dolphins is, of course, they had these skills, you know, but with all of it. So you treat environment, it is autonomous too, like those dolphins. They're autonomous beings. They're their own boss. So you can't treat them like, oh, well, they're very useful, like slaves, you know.
They're not property. Yeah.
Not, yeah, all that. So you don't treat them like that, and you don't treat all this out here like that too, you know, in that sort of way. I thought,
because it'll stop giving and it will stop sharing, and I think that's
yes,
the ultimate story, isn't it?
yeah,
Of if you take too much, it'll stop.
That's right. But also, don't you reckon, Michelle, as a part of law, the idea of having a good, empathetic, ethical, if you like, relationship with others, with rivals, if you want to call them rivals, or staff, or anything, you know, contracts between peoples, groups, companies, it has to be ethical like that. It has
Absolutely.
to be.
And I mean,
it has
the
to be a
entire
foundational thing.
International law situation system of nation states who cannot theoretically, they're all meant to be autonomous. Theoretically, they're meant to be working in extreme respect through their treaties and protocols. And yeah, absolutely.
All that, eh?
Yeah. And folks, if you do want to learn more about Aboriginal perspectives on population management, it is a contentious issue in lots of different cultures. Aboriginal people had strong rules about population management. And if you want to learn more, that I know that there's a lot of anthropological research on pre-colonial population control. But personally, inside the New Economy Network Australia, population is an issue we have to talk about and we have to address, because you know, the fact that it's delicate doesn't mean we can't open it up for discussion. So we have had panel discussions and other things in the past, and we're very happy to have further ones in the future. Alex has got a great question, Mary. So the Western relationship with land is centered on ownership. Paying the rent or mortgage then ties us to a lifetime of working to serve the market. Do you think that the Indigenous relationship to land and their land rights movement has something for all of us in terms of helping to free society from a lifelong commitment to the market? Good question.
Yes, well, I'm sorry, it's the one thing I can't answer really, because I don't know economics that well, and the law comes into it too, taxation, all kinds of stuff. All I know is, as somebody once said about the market, I mean, would you trust the market to look after your children? You know? Would you know, how much power can markets have? You know, so something has to happen there. Something. I thought that was a great, whatever it was. You know, somebody mentioned that, and you just simply wouldn't, would you? You know, and yet everything is left to the market, like you know, neoliberalism. It's, you know, it's the boss of everything. It's that as far as I'm concerned would definitely be a wake-up call to change an economic system, governance system.
Love that. It's such a great way to humanize the market. Would you let it look after your children? 2 points from the non-Indigenous speaker in this discussion today. Richard Dennis, always from the Australia Institute. If you're not familiar with him, he's an Australian commentator and thinker and writer, and all-round excellent guide to look at the economy. As he says, the market is just a bunch of rich people who happen to have shares responding one way or the other to certain policy or other decisions that are being made in a society. So it's not a thing, it's just a bunch of people, and mostly it's rich people. And to come seriously to that question, Alex, I just want to refer you to the session tomorrow night on Wednesday night, on housing. We actually invited a good friend and amazing thinker, Professor Louise Crabtree-Hayes. We'll be talking about how community land trusts are one example of how Western societies can look at land and say, we're taking it out of the economic market, we're putting it back into a place, whether you call it sacralized or a deep foundation of life, or just a basic provisioning thing, and saying the community land trust is like a bunch of human beings who care, becoming the developers who own that land, and it just sits still and then the houses themselves may or may not be bought and sold, but the community land trust holds the land in perpetuity. And I'm no expert on CLTs, I'm sorry, but I asked Louise to talk about it tomorrow night in the housing session, because if we remove land from the property market and just say, here's the foundation of life, now work it out, that's going to transform much of the housing and real estate and our worldview about land as a commodity, as opposed to land as a sacred or moral entity that we're meant to bloody look after.
Yes.
So there's some really interesting issues around CLTs, and obviously Mary can talk at much more length than me about that. That relationist ethos never places the land as something, as she said, you can't invade it, you can't buy and sell it. You live there, you belong to it, you look after it. It's that simple. So if you have that approach, yes, you're pulling that out of the market and you're saying, this is home.
Well, you know, the idea of the, what do you call it, stewardship?
Yes.
Again, working with some people about how you could think about this or bring about whether the state would allow it. Probably wouldn't allow it, I don't think. But so we are all supposed to be, Aboriginal people, supposed to be citizens. We're all citizens. So you can go through all kinds of things that we are called, humans, Homo sapiens are called as part of this modern Western system. Well, why couldn't being a steward be on the same level as a citizen? It's a kind of a citizenship come stewardship. They're joined together somehow on the same way. But whether or not governments or politics, political science, all that, or the law would see how would that work? You'd have to have a whole bunch of people talking, discussing how that could be joined. Could it even be joined? Could it be something like, for example, one part of the governance system of ours, our old governance system, old civilizations elsewhere conflated authority and power. They joined them together. So once you have them joined together, you end up with a hierarchy. And once you've joined them together, the group at the top, whether it's a family like royalty, or whether it's a religious mob or a military mob, they run the whole hierarchy. They run it. They have an army at their service, and so on and so on. What Aboriginal people did was they did something quite unique. They separated power and authority. They were separated. So power is over here. Authority is over here. And authority is, in Aboriginal terms, is older, knowledgeable people, not necessarily only grey-haired and white-haired people, but, you know, could be younger people, but you have to have people who are knowledgeable people, who have a great deal of knowledge, and this is all older people, cross cultures, a great deal of knowledge, a great deal of experience, but also with a very strong ethical, principled way of looking at things. A true authority has to have that as a basis too. So their authority, they're not rulers. There are no rulers in the Aboriginal old system. So there's no idea of rulers and ruled. No idea of command, obedience, nothing like that. And power is always on the side, in the hands of the people. You know that old saying, power to the people? Well, this is an ancient system that actually put that into practice. Actually, because your older relatives are the authority, you know. So for a small group, but real power is in the hands of them, but they don't run things either. So the people are not like rulers either. They're not. There's a good relationship between the two. Respectful, that idea of autonomous regard is definitely there. So people who are authority, they're not bossy. They don't want to order you about. Some of them I know for a fact now. Some of them can be bad-tempered, but you have to put up with that, you know. And you can't be ill-mannered back to them. You can't be ill-mannered back to old people. You can't. You can disagree, but you disagree very, very politely. So it's a balance. It's a balance between, you know, authority and power, not joining together. When the Western system came in, it upset the apple cart, really. It upset a whole lot of things.
Thanks, Mary.
yeah,
Um,
that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We've
No,
got
no.
two more kind of questions, comments that we might focus on, and then we'll wrap up. And thanks everyone for sticking with us for nearly 90 minutes. It's been really fantastic. Lena has asked a great question, which I think speaks a little bit to the book that we're grappling with and playing with. She's asked, how do we merge the two cultures? And I wouldn't use the word merge, but this is Lena's words. How do we merge two cultures, and how do you see this or imagine this happening going forward? Mary, do you want to speak to it first? Like, we hear this all the time in the workshops and the talks we do, you know, non-Indigenous society is struggling for new pathways as our over-extractivism, consumption, our attitudes to nature have caused brought us to a place where things are not functioning healthily. If in Australia, we want to move forward in a better way, you know, what are your view on how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can work together?
Well, I suppose can't say very much apart from it. I don't think there will be a merging of the two because they're so different. But there are, and this is where I'm working with some people from the philosophy department, School of Philosophy in the UQ, and we're talking about the possibility, what if Australia had its own philosophy, you know? And when I say philosophy, I mean a worldview, like a worldview. And the idea isn't to have a philosophy that borrows everything from Aboriginal people, you know, but the idea of the key big thing is the idea of the place of land in the middle of a society, you know. What do you think about land? So somehow there's all kinds of different ways of looking at what an Australian philosophy could be about, and it would be hard, that's true, because Australia is, as a modern place, it's only about not quite 300 years old, you know, and those other old cultures over there, Greece, you know, Persians, Iranians, Chinese, you know, they've had philosophies and religions for thousands of years, you know, and so on. So usually it takes thousands of years or at least centuries to work out different ideas about things like this. But somehow that has to be worked out with, and when I'm not talking about a philosophy, I'm not talking about one standalone philosophy. It could be a whole range of ideas that have been influenced in some ways by an Aboriginal idea, but the key thing is the idea of land. And I always used to think, it's strange, you know, here's our mob, been here for so long, and here is this other mob who essentially, no offense meant, but they were kicked out by their own mob.
Some of us were,
Some of
definitely.
us.
Yep.
Oh yeah, no, I know. I mean,
my
from the
mob were.
beginning,
Yep.
you know, and others were settlers. But nevertheless, it's all colonialism. Just to somehow deal with that idea of colonialism in conjunction with land, you know, somehow they have to come up with different ideas. And the people I'm working with, and us, you and I too, we come up with different ideas about this. So, for example, an idea that you mightn't think has anything to do with an Australian philosophy, that could be, is the idea of, say, logic, because I haven't spoken about it now, but the idea of comparative philosophy, you know, so end up talking about logic, Aristotle and all that. But the idea of that, I think, and taking it from an Aboriginal point of reference, that men and women, men's law, women's law, so that gender, logic is gendered. Now that could easily grow and become an Australian part of an Australian philosophy of view. Do you know what I mean? Because real logicians, you know, are mainly men. And of course, there's white fellas, white women philosophers, I think mainly from other countries, not many though, who talk about that, who talk about gendered logic, you know, because
I must get
men have always thought that.
and I must get some
they
of
own
your
it.
articles that you're working on with the philosopher group onto your profile page on the Future Dreaming website.
Yes.
I am aware that
Anyway,
we're actually out of time, but I just want
yes.
to end.
Okay.
Emma's asked what I think is a lovely question. It is a long question, Emma, but what she's talking about is the characteristics of the work in industrialized societies, this idea of that grinding employee relationship, I guess. Some of us have. She's asked, though, about the notions, I think, of having a free mind, because she said, in my experience as a non-Indigenous person, we don't share daydreams much in our culture. Until reading this recently, I personally have spent most of my life feeling guilty about daydreaming and seeing it as a waste of time. What's your perspective on this? Is this shame a feature of colonialism? Can I just say it's a feature of the Protestant work ethic, that if you're not being busy and you're not working hard, then you're not working your way into God's heaven in the future. But that's a whole nother conversation.
You won't go to heaven, yes.
Yeah. But Mary, did you want to say anything about this idea of, imagination, creativity?
Oh, God. All I would say is daydream away.
Yes.
Do it.
It's the essence of
Should be more of it.
Yeah, of human creativity is to think and to feel and to be creative and to have some free time doing nothing, be a human being, not a human doing.
Yes. No such thing, I think, of wasting time.
No, but our society, absolutely. I mean, I know anyone who knows how I work, I often have to challenge that notion of, I don't want to do anything. Oh my gosh, that must be wrong. Like, no, it's not. Go and sit under that tree and daydream away.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's a very real argument back. Well, if you didn't, if you spent all your time daydreaming, we wouldn't have all this. And all I can think is, well, all of what? What exactly? Atom bombs to drop on other people so that 500,000 people die at one go. All kinds of. I mean, you could just look at all the terrible things. You could look at all the brilliant things, but that idea of long-termism thinking. That's why it's so important, long-termism rather than short-termism.
And I would also say that without a little bit of daydreaming, there is no creative process. A brain that is constantly locked into other people's work is not free to invent something new or create a new solution or enjoy themselves. So, I just wanted to end on that. I thought it was a really lovely question.
Yeah, good.
But look,
okay. Thank you.
I'll start to wrap up, and I just want to say a huge thank you to Mary. Mary's writings and many of her other webinars can be found on the Future Dreaming website, futuredreaming.org.au. Just click on Mary's profile page. And on my part, I'd like to thank you all for your wonderful questions and discussion.
Thank you.
And encourage you all to continue being part of Degrowth Week. The program's on the Humanities page, of course. And tonight we've got some lovely folks from countries other than Australia talking about degrowth, and Tonier will be hosting that one. And tomorrow there's a whole bunch of different topics and issues. And we invite everyone to join us again on Friday at lunchtime, where we're having just an open discussion. We're calling it a roundtable about anyone interested in continuing the work of degrowth that they're already doing and sharing that with us, or connecting with the DNA folks or NENA folks. So, but on that note, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
For your generous time.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye.